Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first public event of Prajna's 16 days campaign against gender violence for 2021. My name is S. Shakthi. I am a Prajnya trustee and volunteer. The purpose of this event today is to launch the 2021 Prajnya Gender Violence in India report. The report is now available on our website, and we will share the link in the chat box here as well, if anyone would like to look at it. Now, one of Prajna's main objectives since its inception has been documentation and to provide information that is carefully researched, easily accessible, and most importantly, free of cost. This report was first written in 2009 to fulfill this objective, and we have updated and published it almost every year since then. Having passed through the hands of a number of different authors over the years, each iteration of the report has built on those that came before it. And what you will see in the 2021 report is really a document that in some sense carries a history of Prajnya itself. Now, while it has evolved significantly over the years, its essence is arguably unchanged, with the continuing aim of providing definitions of different forms of gender violence, explaining how the law in India addresses specific types of violence, and also compiling statistics and highlighting recent cases in the news. To explain this further, we have with us Kausumi Saha, who compiled the report this year. Kausumi is a feminist researcher, and she currently works as a research and communications associate at Gender at Work. She holds a master's in sociology from the Delhi School of Economics, University of Delhi, and will soon commence a second master's degree in psychology from the University of Essex. Her research interests include media and pop culture, youth studies, gender and sexuality, criminal justice, and mental health. This is Kausumi's second time working on Prajna's gender violence report. We are also delighted to have Professor Rukmini Sen with us, who will be giving a talk on gender violence in India, exploring themes that intersect with the report. Professor Sen is a professor of sociology at Dr. B.R. Ambedkar University, Delhi, where she also currently serves as the director of the Outreach and Extension Division and Center for Publishing. Her areas of teaching and research interests are the sociology of law, gender justice, kinship and family, cities and cultures. She is a recipient of the 2020 Viscomp Sahas Award, recognizing her continuous engagement with curricula using an intersectional lens. She has been the principal or co-investigator on multiple projects, including the International Research Collaboration, Teaching Feminisms, Transforming Lives, with the University of Edinburgh, funded by the University Grants Commission and the UK-India Education and Research Initiative. She is also a co-member of the core group on women of the National Human Rights Commission, which she has been since 2019. She has written several journal articles and book chapters, as well as co-edited books and special issues of journals. And the most recent of her books is Doing Feminisms in the Academy, Identity, Institutional Pedagogy, and Critical Classrooms in India and the UK, co-edited with Radhika Govinda, Fiona McKay, and Krishna Menon, and published by Zuban. I'm going to now hand over to Kausumi, who will provide an overview of the report and some key points and key takeaways from the report this year. After this, we will proceed to Rukmini's talk, and then following that, we will take questions from the audience. I request everyone to please keep your mics on mute while the speakers are talking. And if you would like to ask questions during their talks, please feel free to do so in the chat box. And after they are done, you can also unmute and ask questions. Thank you. Over to you, Kausumi.
Thanks a lot, Shakti, for that introduction. I hope I am audible. Can someone just, okay, great. So I have a short PPT that could, that would just help you follow along. So I'll just share that now. Can everyone see it? All right. I'll start now then. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am going to tell you a little bit about the Gender Violence in India Report 2021. Firstly, I'd like to let everyone know that the report is a work in progress. And every year we think about how we can make it more inclusive, more authentic, accurate, and more importantly, more intersectional in its approach. So in the recent years, not only do we define various forms of gender-based violence, as they are mentioned in legal frameworks, policy frameworks by different CSOs, but we are also trying to understand how different groups, different communities who are in different social positions actually experience gender-based violence in very different ways. So this year, the 2021 report, we're very happy to say that we've included a new chapter on gender-based violence against Dalit and Adivasi communities, which I'll go over with you in a little bit. But the plan is that we try to understand how different groups of people with different forms of inequalities actually have a very different experience of gender-based violence, how they get justice, how they are victimized, so on and so forth. The gender violence in India report primarily uses data from the National Crime Records Bureau, the Crime in India reports every year, and we do this with a pinch of salt because we know that the data only tells us, how many cases have been reported and how many cases have actually been accepted within the justice system. Additionally, we also provide data and statistics from other, state-based NGOs, state-based agencies, as well as international and state agencies and international and national organizations. Finally, we provide an overview of the year's significant developments in policy, in law, as well as important judgments, important cases that have been recorded in media. So finally, we'll go with, I'll tell you a little bit about what has been the highlights of 2020 and 2021 in terms of gender-based violence. I will not go over every chapter of the report because that would take too much of our time. It's 16 chapters, but please, I'd urge you to read, give the report a read for greater detail on everything I talk about today. The first chapter on the gender violence report is about prenatal sex selection or female feticide, which actually is in India actually experiences one of the highest rates of prenatal and postnatal sex selection in the world. It's according to UNFPA, it's around 40% of the total missing female births in the year in the world due to gender-based sex selection. A phenomenon which leads to what we often call as missing women. Recently, a significant development in India has been the new draft population control bill in Uttar Pradesh, which is highly punitive in its nature, and it actually bars people who have more than 2 children from various things like applying to government jobs, getting government subsidies, and so on. And this has been criticized widely, not only because it could actually lead to, and it probably will actually lead to higher instances of female feticide, as well as unsafe abortions. It targets certain communities, as we know, and moreover, it takes away agency from women and control over their own bodies and over their own reproductive lives. Child early and forced marriage, which is also known as CEFM, has been steadily rising during the pandemic because, as we know, there's higher economic instability. When children from working classes and lower socioeconomic groups, they're not able to send their children to school. There's no midday meals. They're losing their incomes. They're more prone to more of the boys are pushed towards child labor, while many of the girls are pushed towards early marriage or child marriage. In fact, early marriage is supposed to be one of the, along with dowry violence, domestic violence, etc., is a major contributor to negative mental health of adolescent girls in India and suicidal tendencies, which is no surprises there. Recently, the government of India has has created a task force which has recommended increasing the legal age of marriage of girls in India to 21, which once again face critique from feminists and CSOs because, as we know, having the legal age of marriage to 18 hasn't actually done anything to stop child early and forced marriage, unless there's a complete overhaul of a structural change in how we see female children and marriage and so on. Human trafficking has also been steadily on the rise in COVID-19 and during the lockdown, once again because of increased economic vulnerability, increased migration, which have not been trackable, as well as slowing down rescue initiatives because anti-human trafficking units have not been functional during the lockdown and overall during the pandemic. In response, the government of India has introduced the Trafficking in Persons 2021 bill, which is actually a rework on the 2018 bill, which had been highly criticized for various reasons. However, the Trafficking in Persons 2021 bill has its own set of problems. It has said to be highly infantilizing of girls especially, but also victims of trafficking in general. And there have been complaints by the Durbar Mohila Samanvay Committee and other organizations that it criminalizes sex workers by including pornography and prostitution within its purview, which where everyone who works as a sex worker, the concept of voluntary sex work is not taken into account, and which is why anyone who is a sex worker is either a victim by default, or if a sex worker or anyone else who supports a sex worker peer can be considered a trafficker. Workplace sexual harassment in the pandemic has found new ways of expressing itself as more and more workplaces have shifted online. So, there have been instances of cyber-based violence as well in online classrooms, in online workplaces through sending images, etc., over email and social media. Some important cases over the last few years have been that in 2021, a female officer of the Indian Air Force actually who accused a fellow officer of raping her has allegedly been subjected to the two-finger test, which is not only problematic in itself, but also illegal. Similarly, I think most of us might know about the case of sexual harassment against the then Chief Justice of India, which showed that there are actually no mechanisms in India's sexual workplace harassment laws to actually complain the Chief Justice of India. This is very interesting, and I don't have time to go into it, but if anyone wants, I'm happy to share resources for you to read more about this. Two other cases that really made its mark this year, of course, is the acquittal of Tarun Tejpal, the former editor-in-chief of Tehelka. This judgment has actually been appealed by the Goa government, which has said that the court really put the victim or the complainant on a pedestal, used her past sexual life, her sexual history, her educational history to victimize her further, and to not take her seriously, what we would call, slut shamed her, basically. However, another win perhaps for feminists has been the judgment for Priya Ramani, the criminal defamation case brought against her by MJ Akbar, where the court actually ruled in favor of her and said that due to redressal mechanisms not being in place when she had initially complained, that it cannot be said that she has not gone through the proper channels. Moreover, that a woman has the right to, share her concerns, to share her accusations anywhere she chooses to. In terms of crimes committed in the name of honor, honor killing, we have cases of this everywhere every day in the news. But I think one case that really stood out this year was that in the murders of S. Murugesan and D. Kannagi, an intercaste married couple, where S. Murugesan was a Dalit person, and Kannagi's family actually had both of them murdered after they married. 18 years after that incident, they have finally been sentenced, when one person has been sentenced to death and 12 people to life imprisonment. Similarly, we have over the last few years, due to changes in increased fundamentalist forces in India, we've had this new wave of so-called love jihad cases and crimes related to that, which is another form of honor-related crimes, which having its roots in both casteism and patriarchy, but also Islamophobia. And in fact, there have not been any, when you really look at it, there have not been any such cases registered. And there was the Union Minister of State, Sri Kishan Reddy, actually responded to a question on this in the Lok Sabha, saying that, no case of love jihad has been reported by any of the central agencies. And yet this idea that Muslim men are actually trying to convert Hindu women by marrying them is all over the place in the news almost every day. Rape has been on the rise this year, and for instance, the data from the Delhi police says that that there have been 1.5 times more rape cases reported in the first half of 2021 as compared to last year. Now, this can mean an increase in reporting, which is at the end of the day a good thing, but we don't really know if that's the case. Once again, I think a case that really stood out this year was a case at IIT Guwahati, where the accused was allowed bail by the High Court because he was considered to be a future asset of the country, as well as the rustication notice that IIT sent to him was overturned. At the same time, a division bench at the Kerala High Court expanded the definition of rape by stating that a non-penetrative sexual act between the thighs of a victim in this instance or other non-penetrative sexual act can be defined as rape under the law. I think most of us know that domestic violence has been on the rise during the pandemic and the lockdown for several reasons, to the extent that it has often been referred to as a shadow pandemic alongside other forms of gender-based violence. In 2021, actually, between January and May, the National Commission for Women recorded the highest number of domestic violence complaints in any year since the year 2000. Cyber violence, for very obvious reasons, as more of us have shifted online, our workplaces, our classrooms have shifted online. Cyber violence has been on the rise, but that has also taken various different forms. For instance, during the second wave of the pandemic, when hospital beds, oxygen support was not available, and more women had to share their contact details online while looking for their family members, for their loved ones. Many of their phone numbers were circulated widely without their consent, and they have faced harassment of various kinds. For instance, unwanted phone calls, images shared, messages, and so on. In another instance of both gender and religion-based violence, there was an app called Sulli Deal. Sulli is a very derogatory word for Muslim women used by mostly right-wing people in India. This app was created in June 2021 that showcased the details, personal details, images, etc., of hundreds of Indian Muslim women, some Pakistani Muslim women, and pretended to actually allow its users to buy them and auction them off. Similarly, even earlier during Eid, there was a YouTube channel that ran a live so-called auction of Muslim women from India and Pakistan, and people in the comments threatened various kinds of gender-based and other kinds of violence against them. Finally, the new section in this year's Gender Violence in India report which is the GBV against Dalit and Adivasi persons. Like I said, we keep in mind that gender violence cannot be read independently of the intersecting identities of caste, tribe, economic class, disability, ability, sexual orientation, and so on. And power dynamics really lie at the center of gender-based violence. The various kinds of marginalizations that Dalit and Adivasi women face because of their social identity, their cultural identity, their economic identities, and so on, which means that they are much more vulnerable to sexual violence, gender-based violence than many other sections of society. We have several examples of this that I will not go into right now, but I would like to highlight that in 2021, the All India Dalit Mahila Adhikar Manch actually observed that there was that Dalit and Adivasi women are systematically kept away from being able to report the gender-based violence against them by refusing to accept their FIRs, by discouraging them from filing complaints, delaying their cases, by refusing to produce them in front of the judicial magistrate, helping in actually filing counter cases against them, and so on. It also pointed out the very low level of the very low conviction rates and ineffective implementation of the SC/ST Prevention of Atrocities Act. That is a little bit about the report this year. It's very brief. Once again, I'd urge you to take a look at the report, which details all of this, has many more chapters. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Kausumi, for that very clear overview of the report. I think we'll move on now to Professor Rukmini Sen's talk. Please go ahead, Rukmini.
Thank you very much, Shakti. Good morning, everyone. My sincere gratitude to Prajnya for having me be part of their launch of their flagship and extremely significant Gender Violence in India Report 2021. I'm especially delighted that this launch coincides with the beginning of the 16 days of activism and the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, today, 25th of November. While I'm certain that most in this audience are aware, yet I would like to remind us that on November 25, 1960, the three Mirabal sisters, Patria, Minerva, and Maria Teresa, were brutally assassinated because of their identity as women and as activists. Their only crime was having fought for their rights against the Dominican dictator, Rafael Trujillo. And they had helped to organize and grow the underground movement challenging this dictatorial regime. The state's murder of these three sisters, aged 36, 34, and 25, on the said date, outraged the public and was a key trigger for Trujillo's own assassination by a group of dissidents and former allies 6 months later. After the transition to democracy in the late 1970s, the butterflies, as the Dominicans called these sisters, became a symbol of both democratic and feminist resistance. On December 20, 1993, the United Nations General Assembly had adopted the Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women. Their goal was to eradicate violence against women and girls on a global scale. On February 7th, 2000, the UN officially designated today, that is November 25th, as the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. Remembering state impunity of any form of resistance, and especially being threatened by any form of resilient solidarities, I would like us to salute the fighting spirits of all women and people of multiple genders, encountering, negotiating, surviving violence in their homes, workplaces, streets, or caught in the crossfires of conflicts. It is equally important to foreground the importance of care and support that is needed as we engage with violence. More on this as I move ahead in the talk. This year's UN theme, Orange the World, End Violence Against Women Now, aims to advocate for inclusive, comprehensive, and long-term strategies to prevent and eliminate war. Secondly, to amplify the success stories demonstrating that violence against women and girls is preventable. Thirdly, to promote the leadership of women and girls in their diversity in decision-making and policy building. And fourth, engage Generation Equality Forum commitment makers in each of our countries to collaborate in the implementation of these bold new commitments. Prajna's effort in the next 16 days definitely seems to touch upon all of these initiatives that the UN has already mentioned. Linking the UN theme and the Prajnya report findings is a correlation. This talk is proposed to be divided into the following sections. Number one, conceptual and methodological questions that arise from Prajna's report. Number two, studying violence, researching violence. And finally, ending with proposing talking care alongside violence. I start with the conceptual and the methodological questions in this extremely important report. I will not repeat things that has already been mentioned by Kausumi. The most important aspect of this report, not just this year, but over the years, is of course the use of NCRB data since 1955 to highlight the different categorization of crimes against women. This quantitative classification is a good example actually of both numbers as well as narratives behind numbers. Although the narratives are not present, we can make an analysis of it. From which year a particular crime was identified and started getting calculated gives an indication on what is the kind of data that the NCRB is intending to collect. Also, enactment of specific laws led to the enumeration of certain kinds of criminal acts against women. The extent to which intersectional information is available for crimes against scheduled caste and scheduled tribe women, like outraging their modesty, kidnapping, and rape, while girl children form a separate category in cyber crimes and minor girls in trafficking. Since 2018, identifying rape of a woman with physical, mental disability and rape of pregnant woman is also happening separately due to the changes in the rape laws post-2013. There are 16 categories of gender-based violence that is discussed in the report, following a consistent pattern, and I'm emphasizing on the pattern that the report takes. It has, number one, what is the nature of the violence in question? Number two, the manner in which international human rights conventions, protocols define this violence. Number three, data available on the violence from government sources, international agencies, Indian human rights fact-finding reports. Number four, mentioning the existing laws and specific provisions in the Indian Penal Code that address this specific gender-based violence in question. Number five, recent newspaper-based reporting or NGO reporting news on that specific violence. Number six, ways of accessing the criminal justice system when a specific incidence of gender-based violence happened. And number seven, a brief discussion on the decisions coming in recent judicial pronouncements around violence when it reaches the court. So we are actually dealing with two things, whether things are reported and whether things go to court. And I'm kind of thinking that the report actually addresses both. As someone who has been teaching and writing on gender-based violence now for many years, this is a very comprehensive approach. And also, with the annual reports all available online, it is a valuable resource for researchers and practitioners to compare and see trajectories of violence over the years. The FIR Ready Reckoner, as the appendix, is equally relevant and tells the reader the before and the after of the FIR, together with steps, processes, officers that needs to be remembered when at the police station. While violence on women with disabilities specifically does not form a part of this report, I was, however, wondering whether it can find some space in subsequent reports, although this disaggregated data is not collected through NCRB yet. Prajnya, together with Shanta Memorial Rehabilitation Center, has already come up with a report on sexual and gender-based violence taken women with disabilities in 2020, available on Prajnya's website, where the sites of violence are very distinctly earmarked of violence that are faced by women with disabilities. These are public spaces, institutional spaces and context, and violence related to structural inequality. I want to refer to a recent judgment, Patan Jamal Wali versus State of Andhra Pradesh in the Supreme Court of India, arising out of an SLP. The case involved a 19-year-old blind woman who was raped by her brother's friend. The court, in its April judgment, rendered by Justice Chandrachud, using the lens of intersectionality, where caste, gender, and disability were all entangled, acknowledged the threat of sexual violence for women and girls with disabilities as an all too familiar fixture of their lives. It set straight that women with disabilities are not weak, helpless, or incapable. I quote from the judgment, such a negative presumption of disability translating into incapacity would be inconsistent with the forward-thinking conceptualization of disabled lives embodied in our law and increasingly, albeit slowly, in our social consciousness, unquote. The judgment went ahead to record that the NCRB should seriously consider the possibility of maintaining disaggregated data on gender-based violence for women with disability. My request somehow comes from, the recommendation that has already been made by the highest court. In another context, while since 2016, the NCRB is adding transgender as a category among trafficked victims, it comes in footnotes, of course, in NCRB reports, among trafficked victims or those rescued, yet that may not truly represent the magnitude of crimes against transgender persons. A 2015 report by Sangama of Kerala highlighted high rates of violence against transgender persons, particularly perpetrated by police personnel. More than half, 52% of the respondents in this report had said that they had been harassed by the police, and nearly all, that is 96%, had said that they had not raised a complaint because of their gender identity. The government has not initiated any survey or census on important issues that affect the Transgender Committee. This is something that has been said by the founder and the director of Sahodori Foundation, Kalki Subramaniam, on the lack of countrywide data addressing transgender issues. I'm kind of therefore trying to suggest that while more detailed discussion on violence against transgenders and women with disabilities would further enrich these reports in the next years, I sincerely hope that these reports will find a way into reading lists of students pursuing gender studies, interdisciplinary law courses, or human rights education, and make engagements not only with the content, but also the method in which this content has been gathered. I come to the next bit of the talk, which I'm titling Studying Violence, Researching Violence. And I also see that in the next few days, there's a good, huge panel discussion also around research on violence. Gail Omvedt, whom we lost earlier this year in a classic contribution in 1990, which is titled Violence Against Women, New Movements and New Theories in India, made two very fundamental arguments. Number one, the pervasive violence against women has an obvious economic function in keeping women under control, preventing them from going out of the home, forcing them to the most low-paid or unpaid forms of labor. And number two, they argued the close connection of violence with sexuality. Does violence necessarily have a sexual character? And is sexuality inherently linked to the force and dominance, or can we locate social and historical facts that determine the nature of this linkage? And a third proposition that she made was the need to look at different forms of violence confronted by different sections of women, what today, in Prajna's report and also in other reports we are calling as intersectionality. Gail Ombed talked about the relationship between violence and caste, class, rural-urban divisions, nationality, region, etc. While Origins of Family, Private Property and the State by Friedrich Engels gives us one kind of a theoretical explanation about the interconnection between the women economy exploitation, the other argument I want to push is got from the Phule-Periyar Ambedkarite traditions and engages with questions of marriage, sexuality and Brahminical patriarchy. Marriage, for Periyar, regulated and disciplined women's familial and reproductive labor, even as it actively denied their desires and rights to a self-respecting life of their choice. As V. Geeta had written in her essay, which is titled The Story of a Marriage Being a Tale of Self-Respect Unions and What Happened to Them, self-respect marriages refused the services of Brahmin priests, but did not insist that they should be replaced by either non-Brahmin priests or Tamil priests. The self-respect marriage form was premised on the idea of revocability, and with the freedom to part being inscribed into the marriage ideal, no guarantees could possibly be given or taken except, of course, those which are voluntarily agreed upon by the couple in question. Often, these guarantees within a self-respect marriage had to deal with love and companionship, insisting on these as the founding premises of marriage. In the contexts of honor killings and love jihad, talking about self-respect marriages today is definitely a radical talk. Together with the way in which the Allahabad High Court pronounces in September 2021 that two adults have the rights to marry whoever they want, irrespective of their religion. The judgment says, and I quote, "As the present petition is a joint petition by two individuals who claims to be in love with each other and are major, therefore, in our considered opinion, nobody, not even their parents, could object to their relationship," unquote. What the judiciary is pronouncing today is what we could remember Dr. B.R. Ambedkar writing in his famous Annihilation of Caste 1936 speech, and I'm quoting, "I'm convinced that the real remedy is intermarriage. Fusion of blood can alone create the feeling of kith and kin, and unless this feeling of kinship, of being kindred, becomes paramount, the separatist feeling, the feeling of being aliens created by caste will not vanish," unquote. What I'm trying to probably suggest is that when we talk violence, there is a need to talk about a broader social and a familial and a kinship structure. These cannot be disconnected conversations. In a recently completed course on marriage, kinship, and family forms in 2020 with undergraduate sociology students at Ambedkar University, Delhi, where I teach. Students had posed the question to me towards the end of the class: can we sociologically study family in separation from marriage? Sorry, in separation from violence, not marriage, in separation from violence. So the question was, can we do a study on the sociology of family and not actually study the sociology of violence? This seemed to resonate with Kalpana Kannabiran's point of departure in her edited book, Violence Studies. And in the blurb of the book, it's written, violence is embedded in our everyday. We encounter not only its overt, raw, and brutal nature, but also the deeply buried, invisible, and insidious forms that normalize violence in the collective conscience, making it less noticeable and more tolerable, unquote. So this was a response in a course on marriage, family, and kinship. On the other hand, while doing a course on violence, feminist critiques and resistances with gender studies students in 2018 at Ambedkar University, Delhi, the ordinariness of violence, not the event-driven ones, but the everyday ones, not the ones which only make national headlines, but also the ones that are projected as politicized or political. Invariably the instances where intersectionality of the violence is evident. Case in point, Hathras, about which Kalpana Kannabiran spoke at length in the last year's Prajnya lecture, and also Unnao, which finds mention twice in this year's Prajna report. Through this course on violence, we had done an exercise of walking the city. As a group of people, identifying oneself through multiple genders in the evening, in an area which is historically significant in Delhi. Those of you who are familiar with Delhi, this is the Qutub and the Mehroli archaeological complex, and yet is not explored as a site for feminist classroom. My praxis was to walk, and by walking is to knowing, and knowing is the first step towards overcoming fear of public spaces, is a step towards developing feminist consciousness, which of course is the larger intended goal. In this assignment, one of the students had reflected, and I quote from what she had said, this took the form of an experiential walk because it not only assured us that public spaces are in reality supposed to be public, but because each one of us who shared this experience now holds the narrative that affirms faith in solidarity, unquote. I want to end this section by talking about the need to interrogate the legal language and practices through which violence is juridically expressed. And I'm thinking through Professor Upendra Bakshi's very famous piece, Taking Suffering Seriously, that it is important for one major institution of governance, and he's talking about the judiciary, in the context of the Agra shelter home case, which ran through many years. So he's saying that it is important for one major institution of governance to take people's miseries seriously. I quote, "For those who take people's suffering seriously, there is no rejoicing. Even revolutions provide transient occasions of celebration," unquote. In the language and practice of law, the insistence on certainty, the need to translate the experience of suffering or the experience of violence into a language of reasonableness in order for it to be judicially recognized needs to be questioned, not just in the courts of law, that is in the practice of law, but also in the way in which law is taught. The French feminist Anne Leclerc had written many years ago in the 1980s, and I quote from her, "All I want is my voice. You let me speak, yes, but I don't want your voice. I want my own. I have to reveal everything that you have so determinedly hidden. The only thing you demand insistently is our silence," unquote. While clearly silence around violence against women has been broken in many ways, and Kausumi in her presentation also mentioned that number of reported cases have increased, and one definitely wonders that the fact that it had increased would somehow mean that there is a way in which some shackles are broken. Yeah. However, having said that, yet silence still continues in connection to social and state-based hierarchies and in connection to modes and accepted expressions of that violence. So how can you talk about your violence is also something that is kind of given, structured, and laid down. To that extent, then silence still remains, and it's still a quest towards a voice. I end with this last section, which I'm calling Talking Care Alongside Violence. And this is definitely, to me, still a work in progress, but I'm taking the opportunity to talk about it, using Prajna's platform to talk about it. I will conclude by pointing out something that we are all aware of. Kausumi mentioned in her presentation as well, the shadow pandemic, together with the global health pandemic that we encountered. The National Commission for Women had noted that there was a 46% rise in complaints of crimes against women in the first 8 months of 2021 over the corresponding period of last year. Of the 19,953 complaints received between January to July 2021, the highest number of 7,036 were recorded under the right to live with dignity clause, followed by 4,289 complaints of domestic violence and 2,923 complaints of harassment of married women or dowry harassment. The right to live with dignity clause takes into account the emotional abuse of women. It's actually one of the abuses that has formed a part of the Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act 2005. Inclusion of emotional abuse under right to live with dignity is definitely a significant move. And it brings me to argue that it is necessary to talk care, support, friendship together with discussing violence. In my own 2020 essay, EPW essay, Stay Home, Stay Safe, Interrogating Domestic Violence in the Context of the Pandemic, I suggest that we need to push the contours of discussion to reconceptualize both home as well as domesticity. We need to initiate talking about various kinds of shared residences, not only the ones that are formed through heterosexual monogamous marriage, but foreground the political importance of affordable, abuse-free community housing for women. And I'm sure we will all understand that when I'm talking about this and affordable, abuse-free community housing for women, it is to address cutting across private public discourses of violence. It is not a response to only domestic violence. Yeah, it is kind of a proposal to buttress both public and private forms of violence. And when I say this, I am not talking about shelter homes, but the right to housing and shelter of all women and of people who identify themselves as marginal genders. The pandemic again, and more formidably, proved to us how care and support networks outside of the familial became valuable for surviving and sustaining. Need for feminist support groups and conversations in workplaces, going much beyond the presence, the bureaucratic need and the presence of internal complaints committees, which talk about the everyday gendered misogyny in the wake of the concerns raised through #MeToo, as well as the deeply troubling Tejpal judgment, is an absolute need of the hour. The Persons with Disabilities Act 2016 gave us a functional, a service-oriented understanding of care. It's actually one of the very few laws which has a space for care, which also the Mental Health Act has. Care as a feeling is assumed and naturalized within this legislative framework. And you can literally associate the gender attached to care, in this legislation. But care in its affective sense, in the sense in which it will create solidarity, is silenced. Yeah. One can't imagine the law to do it, but one can, of course, imagine feminist spaces to talk about it. I propose that it is needed to articulate that ethics of care, taking into account the exploits of the care economy, but also propagating a feminist politics of interdependence and care, alongside articulating multiple expressions of violence for a sustainable and just future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rukmini. It was such a brilliant, rich talk. And, I think it's given us so much to think about. It was so wide-ranging, but still, cohesive. And at the end, when you were talking about this, really in our context, quite a radical imagining of care, I think that's really something that we need to think about more. And, you made so many interesting points, even about the structural factors behind gender violence, the limits of the law, which I think, feminist legal scholars have been trying to highlight. I was also reminded when you spoke about, walking the city with your students, just about, why loiter, Shilpa Fatke and Samira Khan and Shilpa Ranade, and just this idea that we need to be able to access the city in different ways on our own terms. I think, these are all important points, and also just the everydayness of violence rather than focusing on sort of extreme events, just the sort of ways in which it can be built into daily life is also something that as feminists we need to interrogate more. I also really appreciated your wonderful analysis of the report itself, the sort of in-depth reading that you've given to the report, and your excellent suggestions for how we can take it forward in the future. I think you really got to the heart of what the report is about. And also brought out some of the messiness that we also grapple with in terms of data, and how to actually read data when it is itself incomplete and difficult to piece together. And I think definitely Kausumi will have something to say about the including something on violence faced by persons with disabilities, which was a conversation we had this year as well, and we're hoping maybe in subsequent years to definitely include that. And I think she has a question, so I'll hand over to Kausumi now.
No, I don't have a question right now, but I just want to thank you once again for, of course, all the nice things you said about the report, but overall, you've put so much thought into it. And yes, thank you for bringing into, talking about all the different ways that, we are yet to address gender-based violence in the report, but also throughout your talk, it just so many things resonated. I think especially like you said, the everydayness of violence, the normalizing of violence. And I think Veena Das also wrote on this, everyday violence in the everyday, and how language actually perpetuates and discourse perpetuates violence. Also, you also talked about the importance of emotional violence, emotions in general, to how how pervasiveness and overall the whole domain of gender-based violence. But mostly, I think the last, what you mentioned at the end, you brought into the conversation the importance of care and support and friendship. And I think that's very important also, that when it comes to care and care work, we need to move beyond the idea of not just heterosexual relationships, sure, but also sexual and romantic relationships in itself, and think about homosocial relationships, think about family beyond blood and beyond marriage, and how important that is, the importance of community, the importance of friendships, especially to women, especially to gender minorities, for whom their families are not always, the traditional family. So thank you so much. That was so great, and it was so informative, but overall just such a great talk, and I learned so much. Thank you so much.
If I could just say, sorry.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, please go ahead.
No, I was just, because Kausumi brought Veena Das, I was just about to say that is, in fact, the first reading of the violence course that we did in the class on everyday natures of violence. Yeah.
Thanks, Kausumi. I think we have a comment. We have many comments saying, the talk was so wonderful. And I think we have from Dr. Prabha Swaminathan a comment saying, need for feminist space at work is something I've been working on without realizing it. And maybe we could discuss how to make it more structured. I don't know, maybe this is something you would like to comment on.
Sure, Shakti, and thank you so much, Dr. Prabha, for that, for actually the validation from you that you, I suppose from the next iteration, I'll think about this as a feminist workspace, and I'll, credit you for giving this term. But, one of the how do we operationalize it, and are we even close to operationalizing it, is a question. So I think as a response, I want to say three things. Number one is that, for the longest time, and very rightly so, the discussion around the workspace has been around sexual harassment at the workplace. And, starting from Vishaka, looking at what Vishaka gave us to ensure that we have a non-hostile workspace. That's the most important concept, I think, that we got from Vishaka, this non-hostile workspace. And from Vishaka to 2013 legislation, that's a long journey. And of course, because now we have a legislation, therefore it is mandatory to have internal complaints committees. Still before that, if I speak only about higher educational institutions, restricting myself to the city of Delhi, not all higher educational institutions, even in Delhi, had, anti-sexual harassment committees, like some higher educational institutions had, where histories of feminist movement, trade union movement, teachers' bodies, there was a combination of that, which kind of led to creation of gender sensitization and anti-sexual harassment bodies in some of the university spaces, but many have come after 2013. Which we also see in, in the report, the 2013 report that came from a UGC UGC mandated committee. Now, so much of the discussion has been around this, around setting up of a committee, around how do we have access to that committee. The committee should be composed of people with certain quasi-legal, abilities, and the committee also will work in a quasi-legal manner. It will not be a law space. And yet, in some ways, over a period of time, we have understood the possibilities of this, but also the limitations of this, the limitations of a quasi-legal committees like this, but also the need for this. And to me, law is always this double bind, right? The impossibility and the inevitability at the same point in time. So that is one set of ways in which we have tried to create the workspace, a more non-hostile workspace. A second, I think, and to me, that is what the #MeToo movement actually threw in front of us, is to think about more informal conversational spaces where we can talk about everyday, hierarchies and misogynies. Because the thing with the first is that some incident has to happen, some incident has to be reported, and then, it will be taken forward in the complaints committee. Of course, there is a need towards gender sensitization. Of course, that is there. But at the same point of time, I still feel that informal spaces of, conversations between students and faculty, between faculty and staff, which is the most difficult thing in higher educational institutions. I'm sorry if I'm being, limiting myself to higher education spaces, but that's the space that I know. Therefore, I'm talking about it. I'm sure it operates in different ways in other workspaces. So these conversations are necessary, and these conversations will be messy. These conversations will not be easy. Yeah. And yet I feel these conversations are necessary. And sometimes I feel that doing gender auditing of our workspaces can be an interesting entry point to these conversations. And, gender auditing with respect to, of course, profile, but also with respect to hierarchy, seeing glass ceiling, etc. For educational spaces, doing gender auditing of courses, of infrastructural facilities within, workspaces. I think that could be a beginning, or that could be connected with these conversations to make it a more feminist workspace. Finally, the last thing is something which I kind of encountered, briefly between 2015 and 2017. I was the president of the faculty association of our university, and as on that capacity, we were actually engaging with medical rules. And who benefits with respect to, medical benefits, who gets it and who doesn't get it. And this is not just medical rules. If we look at service conditions and also medical rules, we will realize that the entire understanding is based on a heterosexual, monogamous, reproductive, reproductive-based family. And to me, engaging with these policies is very important in a workspace, because, it is literally like, so things like who can be your dependent, that is determined by kinship. For whose care can you legitimately take leave? Think about that. Yeah. Can I actually say that I want to take leave to help a friend who is, let's say, in some kind of a distress? Yeah. How do you even explain that? I'm kind of trying to think that even language, falls flat there. So these kinds of policies and engaging, taking a feminist lens and engaging with them in the workspaces is a third thing that we definitely need to do. Sorry, it was a long response.
No, that was really helpful. And I think really, again, the point you have been making even in the talk, which is just at the end you were saying, sort of reimagining what we mean by family networks, kinship networks, kind of expanding our understanding of that to beyond the sort of what is considered normative right now. And also, you also made some other very important points about workplace sexual harassment. I think there's more. Could we know more about your course on violence? If you'd like to say something on that.
So this is a course that I taught only once, and this is a course that is done through the MA Gender Studies program of the School of Human Studies. Interestingly, it kind of coincided with the project, the collaborative project that we were doing with the University of Edinburgh on, teaching feminism's transforming lives. So the project was on, and I was part of the project, and I was also doing this course on violence with the students. It's a 2-credit elective course, but no, I think it's a 2-credit compulsory course that all students of gender studies are to take, and it is elective to other students from other disciplines. We do, a run through of what should I say, of both classical as well as contemporary feminist ways in which we will address gender. And I think from the very beginning, the main argument that the course had taken was that it is important to talk about the everydayness of violence. And, to kind of decenter the event-based, hyper sensationalized way in which violence is understood, not to suggest that we shouldn't be talking about it. So the course, of course, it was done in 2018. So the course, of course, did talk about, some of the instances of violence which made to newspapers and which did do headlines. That's one aspect of more of a conceptual aspect of the course, but the course also historically went back to the formation of the nation state and violence, which was at the heart of the formation of the nation state, both in terms of communal violence, and disruption between communities and distrust, but also in terms of the recovery and abduction. Basically abduction and recovery. And one of our laws at the founding moment was actually to recover abducted women in order to save the nation and the honor, etc. So in some ways, honor was actually at the heart of nation building itself. Yeah. So that's another part. And I'll end by saying that the last part of it did discuss, issues relating to questions around bodies and violences. And we looked at masculinities there, both conceptually as well as empirically in certain ways. We looked at state impunity and the way in which certain bodies are not even visibilized by the state. So yeah, roughly these were the 3 or 4 broad sections. If you're interested, I can share the course outline with you. It's an open thing. It's not a hidden document.
Dr. Prabha Swaminathan also said, could this be an online course for all faculties all over India?
I need a platform to do that. Provide one, I'll do it.
I was just, sort of on a somewhat related note, I was wondering, because I know thinking about pedagogy is also something you're quite interested in as, part of your research. Also, I was not in terms of the actual content of any of your courses, but more generally, when you talk about gender violence with your students in your classroom, I mean, do you have any reflections on how to even talk about these issues in a way that perhaps is not triggering or, does not even cause further harm? Because, as someone who also tries to teach myself, this is something that, it's difficult to grapple with. How do you broach these subjects? If you have any thoughts on this.
Thanks so much, Shakti, for that question. It's like literally reading one's mind, and me going back to the class on violence, actually. It was in one of the violence classes. that for the first time I encountered, and I think and it made me reflect as to whether students had thought about it earlier and did not articulate it. So it made me reflect about my own, practices in a certain way. But in this class, a student did, say that you should have given us a trigger warning before what you are discussing. And what I was discussing that day, I distinctly remember, still, what I was discussing that day was actually about, intimate romantic relationships and what happens when there is a breach of trust in that. We were actually discussing something in the lines of whether, promising marriage, so promise to marry becoming rape cases. That's actually there there's actually one entry of that in your report as well, of a particular case, if I'm not wrong. So that was actually the context to discuss, promise to marry and, what happens when the marriage doesn't happen, etc. Clearly, it is a breach of a certain kind of a trust in the intimate relationship. But can you articulate that through breach of trust? Can you articulate? Because again, within the space of law, it doesn't seem to be there. You have to articulate it through, putting in a charge of sexual assault. So it was in this discussion I could understand, and this was actually articulated, that you should have said that, what you will be discussing would be very heavy. It is close to us, and these trigger warnings are necessary. So I think, I should admit that from then onwards, when I, initiate a discussion, or before I initiate a discussion, when I share readings, I do kind of let students know what these readings will be about. And in some senses, to remain prepared that, this might cause anxiety and agony. But at the same point in time, Shakti, I also feel that one can only do that much as an instructor beforehand. One can't control the flow of a class and a class discussion. And I actually want to say this, as even in these pandemic times when I'm not seeing students, and that's making me angry. But at the same point in time, even in these pandemic times, in these online classes also, it is so difficult to actually predetermine that despite giving a trigger warning, it will not happen. Yeah. So then you are left with hand holding at the moment. And I actually think pauses in the classroom is important. Yeah. The unease in the classroom is actually important. I definitely don't want to believe that classroom is a very sanitized space, because we don't, the things that we discuss are messy, and it is supposed to create, certain, how do you empathetically deal with it is a question. I'm not trying to say that one always does it, or one always effectively does it. I don't think so. I'm sure I have failed. I did fail that day, clearly. Yeah. But at the same point in time, it makes you much more self-reflexive, and constantly, keeps you on guard as to how you say what you say and how will it be taken. Now, while you do not have any control over how will it be taken, if there is a response, if there is an articulation, how to give space for that. And that kind of connects with this, my larger point on how do you give space for conversations.
Thank you so much. I think there's a question from Samira Khan. I'll just read it out. I'm glad you stressed, Dr. Sen, on the importance of everydayness of violence, especially when I teach workshops for the media on how to report on sexual violence or rape, this becomes a very important point to stress, especially as the media tends to exceptionalize rape and sexual violence and play up only certain individual cases. So more of a comment, but I don't know if you'd maybe like to say something on this as well.
No, thanks a lot, Samira, for that. I just want to go back to something that Shakti said, that of course, this entire idea of walking in the city, connecting it with Viloiter, actually reading Viloiter. My undergrad gender and society students did a reflection on a chapter on Viloiter and did, photo essays around it. And then, I tried this thing with the MA class. But yeah, it's... I suppose media, yes, in one way. And the way in which the media is reporting incidents of violence, but also the way in which even media picks and chooses and reports even judgments. And I sincerely believe that we need much more responsible legal journalism in this country, in the mainstream press. It of course is happening brilliantly in social media platforms. So what eventually happens is that it kind of just remains either what is reported by the media and the way in which it is reported, or what comes to press in terms of a particular judgment, only if the media picks up that judgment, and wants to talk about it. And therefore as I was preparing for this and looking into this judgment, where also you actually have Justice Chandrachud delivering this judgment on women with disability, where SC/ST Prevention of Atrocities Act has also been used, I failed to see this getting reported in any mainstream media. And that says something on invisibilizing violence on women with disabilities, invisibilizing also important judgments that are made and progressive judgments that are made with respect to sexual violence faced by women with disabilities. So yeah, I'm just kind of pushing this to both in terms of reportage of the violence itself, as well if it eventually goes to court, what the court says. Even there is a very selective representation. Clearly, metropolitan spaces plays a more important role in terms of reportage. We know the larger politics, and to kind of take this to the students in the classroom is the only way in which we might be able to decenter this this exceptionalization of violence.
Thanks a lot. Yeah. Do you study with the police, like going on calls with them as an observer?
Again, so much. So I do a course on law and society, and in that, this is an MA elective course in sociology, which is open to other students as well. And in that, we always used to do a court visit. And we used to go to the nearest district court from where my campus of Ambedkar University is located. It's called the Tisazari Court. But we also once, and that's actually the last iteration of the law and society course where I could take them, we had done a visit to the police station, primarily to interact with the police, understand what their roles and responsibilities are in this area. This is actually, the Chandni Chowk police station is one of the oldest police stations in Delhi. So kind of to understand that, look through, we somehow got access inside the police station as well, so we could look through library, etc., look into FIR and the way in which they maintain reports, etc. But having said that, of course, no, I have still not tried students going with the police as observers. That is something that has not happened. However, one of our first PhD students from the sociology program, he is actually working on the everydayness of the police and comparing cities of Delhi and Trivandrum. And he, in his PhD work, actually did participant observation in the police station, went with police as observers as well. It wasn't easy. It was very difficult to do ethnographies of police station, but he actually did it. We are very hopeful that he'll be submitting his PhD in the next few months. And again, if you're interested, then, I could put you in touch with him. He will be a better person to actually talk about what kind of experiences he had while going with the police. I still haven't done that with all my students. The only thing that I've tried is visit to a police station.
I think we have a question from Dr. Swarna Rajgopalan. She's got a hand up.
Yes. Thank you, Shakthi. Thank you, Rukmini. This was so wonderful. I'm actually stunned by your lecture. And I will need to read it. I'm one of those people who needs to read things also to completely comprehend them. My question is actually for Kausumi, and it's like an invitation to reflect, because when you did the GVR for the first time last year, you came into it really not expecting, I suspect, I mean, I don't think you've been thinking about GV data all your life before then. So in these 2 years that you've done this, what have been things that surprised you, that you began to think more about, just coming in fresh? Because, people think when we do this work, I think people assume that somehow all of us at Prajnya particularly have a degree in gender violence or something. Nobody does. There's no such thing. What did you not expect to find, or what are you continually puzzled by? Because I think those are also insights that would be useful for us going forward. Because certainly we'll do another edition and then another, inshallah. So.
No, thank you for that question. And I will be very honest and say that I think this year I was able to emotionally distance myself a little bit more and write a report, because I found myself last year being quite triggered and relating. I mean, it's a real problem, right? When when you're writing a report on gender violence and you're actively relating, that's scary. And yeah, but I think what puzzles me, of course, is the data and how. But what puzzles me is, of course, the language that we continue to use in the legal system, the language which is highly patriarchal, which is highly infantilizing towards women. And of course, there's rarely any mention of gender minorities and of queer persons anyway, so I can't even say anything about that. So that because of course in everyday life we do engage with that when we read the news, and incidentally I work in the development sector, so I engage with it in various ways. But it's really when writing this report that I actively look over cases, I do not come from a legal background, but I've learned a little bit over the years, to read legal language, to look at data. And I think I am continually shocked and surprised that we still have this kind of language. We still have, we still look at women primarily as victims, of course, and we do not accord them agency. And of course, our rape laws, sexual assault laws still are very gender blind. So all of that is very demoralizing, very shocking, surprising. I mean, I wouldn't say surprising, but regardless, you expect more and you don't get it. So that for sure. And I think the pandemic has been such an eye opener. I mean, we all knew gender violence existed, but the pandemic really brought into light the nuances, the various ways in which something like gender violence can actually I forget the word, but it actually as circumstances change. And I think I keep giving this example, as workplaces, you would assume that when workplaces are shifting online, classrooms are shifting online, people are less out in the streets, the certain kinds of gender violence we produce, but it does not happen. It finds new forms. So definitely that was a key observation I made during the last 2 years, but especially during writing the gender violence report. I'm also very, very happy with the fact that I could be a part of. I mean, I feel like over the last few years, we've started to not only, like I said many times, I think I'm repeating myself, that we, not only look at the forms of gender-based violence, but how people, different kinds of people, they experience it, they are victimized, they are able to even report it, and if they do report it, then how do they even get justice? And I think we are going towards that. We do not just describe forms of violence, but we also talk about different communities, how they experience violence, how they're victimized over and over again. That is great, and I would love, even if I am not a part of it, or if I am, I'd love that the report would go into more depth, more detail of that. I hope that answers your question, Swarna.
Yes, it does. And I also wanted to, with Shakti's permission, do a little commercial. One of the things we've been despairing of, since we do a lot of workplace sexual harassment related training, is that there is very little data, and regularly we get calls, what is the percentage of companies that are compliant, and who knows? So this year we decided to, just like the GVR began as a 12-page document put together by volunteers, we decided to pilot a small survey. So we have 2 volunteers who are writing up the analysis of a very small survey that they did via Google Forms, really very modest. And that will be out in the course of the campaign as well. So I'm hoping that by the time the next edition comes, we will also start to piece together a little bit of the picture of what it takes to, how much compliance, what kind of compliance, what is the impact of checklist compliance, which is what most people do. So I'm hoping that that will happen as well, and that'll be something, another dimension that we can integrate, about which we know surprisingly little even now. So yes, Mariam, to answer your question on the chat. So we have yet another commercial coming when Shakti gives us permission. But thank you so much for everything, Kausumi, for your hard work, for this wonderful talk, Shakti, for doing this. And I will step out now and give it back.
I think we don't have any more questions in the chat, so I would either of you like to say anything to conclude? Is anything you'd like to add, perhaps, Kausumi, Rukmini?
Not really. I just want to thank Prajnya for having me here today, and it was a wonderful, conversation. In the chat box, I just shared, a blogathon event that is going to happen for the next 16 days, which is a collaboration between University of Edinburgh, University of New South Wales, Australia, and the Centre for Publishing, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar University. I've shared the first piece, which is there. I would request people to look at it, amplify it, read it, send your comments. And I just hope that this is a beginning of a longer conversation with many of you here. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
I would just, and I would once again like to, of course, I'd like to thank Dr. Sen, Professor Sen, for all your insights, and also to Swarna, Shakti, and everyone else at Prajnya for giving me these opportunities for the last 2 years, having me over, teaching me so many things, and of course and just exemplifying everything that we talk about in terms of care and community and family and feminist practices within the workplace. I think Prajnya has really shown me how that can be practiced beyond just theory and beyond just speaking about it. So thank you for that.
Thanks so much, Kausumi. I just wrap up by saying we have a full calendar of events over the next 16 days as part of our 16 days campaign this year. Tomorrow we have a really excellent panel to discuss the Dowry Prohibition Act. It's been 60 years since the act was passed in 1961. So please do join us for that. And please do look at our calendars up on our website. And there are lots of events coming up which you might find of interest. And we hope to see you, see many of you at those events as well. Thank you so much, Rukmini and Kausumi. It was a great session. We are so happy to have both of you here. And definitely hope we will see you again very soon. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye. Have a